Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lee and I'll be providing housekeeping for today's webinar. Please disconnect from any VPNs if you encounter bandwidth issues. For other technical issues, ask questions via the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen or by emailing us at fema-hmawebinars@fema.dhs.gov. This email will be chatted to momentarily. This webinar will include pre-recorded remarks followed by live Q&A. Throughout the session, you can submit questions for our speakers via Q&A, which is available at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the webinar, we will ask you to respond to a few polling questions, which will automatically pop up on your screen. Today's session is being recorded for any stakeholders and partners who are not able to attend. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Programs webinar on localized flood risk reduction projects. My name is Kevin Lingenfelter, and I serve as a team lead for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. With me today is Nora Goldberg, a management and program analyst and a specialist in flood mitigation assistance. This session is meant to take a deeper dive into the localized flood risk reduction project type. This is one of our most common project types submitted to FMA's annual grant program. All right, let's get started. Today, we're going to introduce the FMA grant program, discuss the localized flood risk reduction project type, provide tips and resources for preparing a successful application, and share project examples. The purpose of this webinar is to provide examples of a complete and well-written FMA sub-application for localized flood risk reduction projects. FEMA developed this case study in response to feedback from stakeholders that asked for more information on what makes a good FMA sub-application. The intent of this webinar is to help sub-applicants become more familiar with the application process and provide guidance on where to access information and resources. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program was authorized by the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994, strengthened by Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, and further strengthened by the Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts of 2021. The mission of the program is to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings insured under the NFIP, or National Flood Insurance Program. Our program is a competitive program offered annually during a specific application period, which runs at the same time as the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC program. Local communities can apply through eligible applicants, which are states, tribes, and territories. So it's important to note that they should be in contact with the appropriate state agency, as there will likely be different deadlines for submittal and may have different formats for application submission, as well as state priorities. The FEMA program, from its inception, was designated to support the mutual objectives of reinforcing flood insurance and floodplain management policy. It accomplishes this by mitigating partially or completely high-risk, repetitive or severe repetitive loss properties or structures. The program enhances the nation's flood preparedness and resilience by supporting the FEMA mitigation mission, and FMA fits within the FEMA strategic goal of building a culture of preparedness. Here are the Flood Mitigation Assistance eligibility requirements. Applicants and sub-applicants must have FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans by the application deadline. They must also have approved plans when funding is obligated. Applicants are states, District of Columbia, U.S. territory, and federally recognized tribal governments. Each state, territory, and the District of Columbia and federally recognized tribal governments shall designate one agency to serve as the applicant for FMA funding. Each applicant's designated agency may submit only one FMA grant application to FEMA. Sub-applicants are local governments, including cities, townships, counties, special district governments, and tribal governments, including federally recognized tribes who choose to apply as sub-applicants, are considered sub-applicants and must submit sub-applications to their state, territory, or tribal applicant agency. Sub-applicants must be participating in the NFIP and in good standing, not on probation or suspension. Further, structures included in a project sub-application must have NFIP policies in force at the time of the open of the application period and have insurance requirements post-award through the life of the structure. Now let's explore the localized flood risk reduction project type. It's important to understand the distinction between a localized and non-localized flood risk reduction project. Localized flood risk reduction projects are implemented to lessen the frequency or severity of flooding and decrease flood damage within an isolated or confined drainage or catchment area that is not hydraulically linked or connected to a larger basin. Eligible projects reduce flood loss for single structures or facilities, groups of structures, or whole neighborhoods within an isolated or confined drainage area. For complex flood risk reduction projects, sub-applicants are strongly encouraged to use project scoring or a phased project approach. Details about project scoping and phased projects are included later in this presentation. Non-localized flood risk reduction projects lessen the frequency or severity of flooding and decrease flood damage within an area that is hydraulically linked or connected to a drainage basin that is also regional in scale. Non-localized flood risk reduction measures are generally ineligible under FMA. However, these non-localized flood risk reduction projects are eligible under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the HMGP program, HMGP post-fire, and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC grant program. As you can see on this slide, on the left side, we have eligible localized flood risk reduction projects and several examples. On the right side, we have ineligible non-localized flood risk reduction projects. Non-localized projects, they do reduce flood hazards. However, they're at areas larger than that of localized flood risk reduction projects and are not eligible under the FMA program. Now we'll discuss project scoping in phased projects. Capability and capacity building activities, also known as C&CB activities, support the development of future localized flood risk reduction projects and also individual flood mitigation projects that will subsequently reduce flood claims against the National Flood Insurance Program. Project scoping is one of the primary types of C&CB activities. Project scoping can be used to obtain data and to prioritize, select, and develop localized flood risk reduction projects for future funding based on current FEMA-approved mitigation plans. Think of project scoping as everything non-construction, no shovels in the ground at this stage in the localized flood control sub-application development. Project scoping can help applicants and sub-applicants develop eligible and complete applications that include a feasible project budget, appropriate project milestones. A project scoping C&CB application is good for communities that haven't applied for FMA grant funding before, but you have an idea for a project that requires capital. If your community lacks resources to fully flush out a full flood control project, this is a low-risk pathway to the sub-application for a future FEMA grant. Eligible activities include the development of mitigation strategies, cost share strategies, and data gathering, including environmental and historic preservation compliance considerations. And this is to prioritize, select, and develop and complete a timely hazard mitigation assistance application. Next, let's talk phased projects. The image shown at the top depicts a process map of a phased project. Phased project funds are used to develop all the technical and environmental information, including design, engineering studies, and permitting before the issuing a full construction approval. Phased projects allow you to build up your project. You do not have to have all technical details prepared in your sub-application. However, there must be some information in the sub-application that indicates that the proposed solution would resolve the identified flooding issue. Publicly available flood insurance study data would be an example of data that fulfills this requirement. Phased projects are especially useful for communities that cannot leverage upfront capital for project development, such as H&H studies, benefit cost analysis, and etc., without assurance that they'll get the grant. It provides a cushion for the uncertainty of being selected for an expensive, potentially resource-heavy application. Phased projects do require a benefit cost analysis for phase 1 and also for phase 2. BCAs for the Phase 1 sub-application should be based on the best available data and include a detailed explanation of any assumptions that went into the BCA, including any assumptions about after mitigation or residual damage. Phase 1 approval does not guarantee approval for future phases. After Phase 1 is completed, FEMA will complete an eligibility review that includes a cost-effectiveness determination to evaluate if a project meets all eligibility requirements to proceed to Phase 2. BCA should incorporate data from the Phase 1 deliverables analysis and must reflect current site conditions and all revisions to scope and costs made to the project following Phase 1 analysis. When determining whether you have a phased project or project scoping application, the following statements you may want to consider. For project scoping, if you understand the flooding issue at the community or individual household level, but you don't have enough information to submit the sub-application, or if you need financial assistance to collect information that will be used to identify and develop a future flood mitigation project, these are great reasons for project scoping. And for a project scoping or a phase project, if you don't believe you can get the project accomplished in the maximum period of performance, 36 for individual property mitigation or 48 months for localized flood risk reduction projects, you may want to look at scoping or potentially break up your project into phase projects. Now let's walk through how to apply for localized flood risk reduction projects. Let's start with an overview of key components of the sub-application. Then we'll provide specific information and examples for each section of the sub-application, and we'll conclude the webinar by providing a list of available resources for developing a complete FMA localized flood risk reduction application. Each sub-application must contain the minimum sub-application requirements. These requirements include a detailed project narrative and scope of work, description of alternatives, environmental planning and historic preservation considerations, the proposed work schedule, a cost estimate and budget narrative, a description of the operations and maintenance plan, and must demonstrate the project's cost effectiveness. There are also some required federal forms that must be completed and submitted with the sub-application. In your application, the scope of work should explain what the project will involve and how it will reduce flood risk to people, property, or infrastructure. A good scope of work should address the following elements: a detailed description of the proposed activity, technical data to support the design, description of the current flood risk, documentation that the project represents an independent solution or functional part of a solution, and the alternatives considered. We'll go over each item with examples in the next slides. Providing a complete and detailed scope of work is important for the reviewer to understand the proposed project. Clearly explain the proposed mitigation activity, identify the tasks required to complete the proposed activity, and define the task to be accomplished. The scope of work should be used to build work schedule and budget estimate. Your scope of work should answer who, what, when, where, why, and how. The proposed activity example on the slide is a snippet of a scope of work to provide an idea what FMA is looking for during the review process. Technical data is one of the most important parts for confirming whether a project is technically feasible. This should include a written narrative and description of the technical data, such as the snippet of the example shown in this slide. The written narratives should include a list of codes and standards the project will abide by and the design level of the protection. Attach any studies, drawings, reports, analysis, or maps as available that have contributed to the design as supporting documentation. You'll also notice an example map of before and after mitigation flood levels from an H&H study. This is an example of technical data. This is helpful because it shows that the statement of work is supported by engineering analysis and demonstrates the flood levels will be decreased by this project. It's important to note not all projects have to provide a 100-year design level of protection. In the example, there may still be some limited flooding associated with a 100-year event, but mitigation or risk reduction is still taking place since flooding from smaller, more frequent events is being eliminated. Storm drain networks in an urban environment are not typically designed to carry a 100-year storm event, but rather smaller events. The description of the management of the proposed mitigation activity is required. First, consider who will do the maintenance and what tasks they will need to complete over the life of the project for the project to continue to protect against flood. Then estimate how much that maintenance will cost. It's important to show that implementing this project won't create flooding issues in other areas, meaning there won't be any negative upstream or downstream impacts. This could include H&H modeling, which may need to be confirmed as part of the project. For something like a simple culvert upsizing to reduce upstream flooding at a road crossing, it may reduce the flooding upstream of the road, but could introduce new flooding downstream of that road. The road embankment and smaller culvert may have been acting like a stormwater management pond, and upsizing a culvert or other conveyance may displace the flooding to downstream areas. Therefore, an H&H study will be needed to model the potential impacts. To comply with environmental planning and historic preservation requirements, sub-applications must describe the alternative projects that were considered and why these were not chosen. A minimum of 3 total project options must be described. These will include 1, a no-action alternative, 2, an alternative that was considered but not selected, and 3, the proposed project itself. The leftmost image on this slide shows an elevated home. The second image shows what the land might look like if the home on this land were acquired and demolished to restore the natural environment prior to the intrusion of residential infrastructure. The no-action alternative should describe what would happen in the future if no action is taken to mitigate the flooding issue. The alternative project can be something that was feasible but ultimately not chosen for cost, technical feasibility, or other reasons. The proposed action alternative is the project that you are proposing in the sub-application. Explain why it is the most practical, effective, and environmentally sound alternative. First, the sub-application looks at the 2 alternatives that were not chosen. All sub-applications should consider the no-action alternative and one other alternative. In the example on this slide, a levee and construction of a longer conveyance channel was the alternative not selected for this project. The sub-application clearly explains what the alternative would entail and why they were not selected. In this example, a levee and conveyance channel in different locations was considered, but due to the effectiveness and cost was not selected. And now I'll pass it over to Nora to discuss benefiting area maps. Nora?
Thanks, Kevin. Benefiting area maps are required in the FMA sub-application. Localized flood risk reduction projects must demonstrate that the proposed project benefits National Flood Insurance Policy insured properties. Applications should include a map with associated geospatial files delineating the proposed project area or footprint boundary and the benefiting area, which is aligned with flood modeling such as H&H study. The next key component of the FMA sub-application is the work schedule. The work schedule should identify major milestones, such as signing the grant agreement, final design and specifications, bidding and procurement, construction completion, and grant closing with target dates for meeting each milestone. All tasks listed in the scope of work and cost estimate should be included in the schedule. Please be sure to clarify whether the project is phased and what tasks are in each phase. This slide shows an example work schedule. It details major tasks and milestones and identifies how long each of these would take and when they would start. Cost estimates include various cost item categories such as labor, materials, equipment, and subcontractor costs. Source materials used to support the cost estimate are referenced and include sufficient detail so FEMA can determine whether costs are reasonable based on proposed activities and level of effort. The project cost estimate could use multiple methodologies. For example, the cost of construction may come from a contractor, while the administrative costs come from recently constructed projects. It is important to explain where all these costs come from and how they are used in the final cost estimate. Lump sum cost estimates are not acceptable. We will review a few examples of budget documentation. In general, HMA funds may be used to pay up to 75% of the eligible activity costs. The remaining 25% of eligible activity costs are derived from non-federal sources, which may include in-kind services, cash contributions, or loans. The sub-application must describe how the sub-applicant will meet the non-federal cost share and must attach a commitment letter for each funding source. The example cost share shown details the funding source, funding amount, and the percentage of shares by funding source. Next, we will take a high-level look at the cost-effectiveness requirements and methodologies for localized flood risk reduction projects. We will also include resources towards the end of the presentation that can provide more detailed information on how to complete a benefit cost analysis. Every project must be cost-effective to be considered for FEMA funding. A project is cost-effective when the project benefits are higher than the project costs. There are generally three approaches for completing a flood BCA: modeled damages, professional expected damages, and historical damages, depending upon what data is available. To qualify for FEMA funding, projects must comply with federal and state EHP requirements. EHP compliance focuses on protection and enhancement of environmental, historic, and cultural resources. A summary of relevant regulations and required documentation is provided in Appendix E of the HMA guidance under EHP checklist, and in the Flood Risk Reduction EHP Job Aid found on FEMA.gov. While we won't look at all the environmental and historic preservation requirements today, let's look at an example of what meeting environmental and historic preservation compliance can look like. One of the environmental and historic preservation requirements is to show whether the project is near any surface waters, including wetlands. To demonstrate this, a map of the nearby wetlands and surface waters has been provided through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetlands Inventory, which shows that the project is near but not affecting the wetlands. Other examples of EHP documentation may include jurisdictional delineation and/or wetland delineation. In addition, other forms, property site maps, flood insurance rate maps, or FERMETs, and consultation documentation should be included. BCA documentation and maps should be included as available. The assurances and budgets are also critical pieces of information that must be included in the sub-application. The list of required forms can be found in the last section of the application, where items can be checked when prepared and attached. Next, we will discuss application pitfalls and best practices. At the end of FEMA's review of applications, projects are deemed eligible or ineligible. The following are some of the reasons a project may be deemed ineligible. The scope of work is unclear or incomplete. There is unclear conformity with program requirements, such as compliance with FMA program requirements. The community is not an NFIP participating community. FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans are expired or lapsed. There is a lack of repetitively flooded NFIP-insured structures within the benefiting area. There are inadequate considerations for EHP compliance, or there are application inconsistencies, including conflicts within the individual application sections, or there are conflicts between application and the BCA. The following list provides insight into the elements of a successful sub-application for localized flood risk reduction projects. Reference to minimum design criteria and ensuring scope of work is consistent with that criteria. If engineering and surveying documents are available, including stamped and sealed reports, plans, figures, and/or data. If preliminary design has not started, describing performance-based design measures, level of protection desired, and expected benefiting area. Leveraging opportunities to incorporate nature-based and/or climate-based solutions into project scope of work. And referencing available EHP job aids for the development of the scope of work, and providing complete information as required by the EHP checklist. In the final segment of this webinar, we will share a few example localized flood risk reduction projects. Our first project example comes from the state of Montana. The city of Three Forks is a rural community with a population of nearly 2,000 in southwestern Montana, a region that is experiencing rapid growth and development due to its proximity to the city of Bozeman and Yellowstone National Park. In fiscal year 2021, Three Forks submitted and was selected for a localized flood risk reduction project. The community-wide mitigation project will expand culvert and storage pond capacity to mitigate flooding, will protect nearly 1,000 structures from flooding, and will yield multiple ancillary benefits. The application clearly identified the flooding issue, analyzed alternatives, and detailed the benefits of the proposed mitigation activity. Some of the benefits from this project include how it enabled Three Forks to continue to serve as a hub for affordable housing in increasingly unaffordable county. Without a mitigation solution, much of the city would be off limits to development due to flood risk. It removes hundreds of structures and multiple critical facilities from the floodplain. It restores and enhances the Jefferson River historic channels to increase water storage and conveyance. And the project employs a nature-based approach that proved cost-effective and addressed multiple hazards. The next example project comes from the state of Louisiana. In fiscal year 2021, East Baton Rouge Parish submitted and was selected for a localized flood risk reduction project. The project's purpose is to improve the ecological health of Louisiana State University's 6 lakes and to decrease flooding. The proposed improvements consist of floodwater storage and diversion, incorporates low-impact development and nature-based solutions, and provides stormwater management interventions. Some of the benefits from this project include flood risk reduction to 778 households and more than 200 NFIP insured properties, a focus on healthy ecosystems using natural features to provide soil stabilization, and this project provides a benefit to the community in the form of pedestrian and cyclist path improvements. In closing, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program has compiled some resources and tips for submitting a localized flood risk reduction sub-application. First, we encourage you to clearly name attachments in FEMA Go, being sure to include your unique project name and the type of attachment that is being uploaded. Next, consider using the following resources to ensure clear communication of local offices such as transportation, environmental protection, or public works, signed letters from public officials, and/or newspaper articles. And lastly, become familiar with the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide. Refer to the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Mitigation Action Portfolio for additional example projects, and for more information surrounding benefit cost analysis, refer to the resources on FEMA.gov. This concludes the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program's Localized Flood Risk Reduction Project webinar. Thank you for joining us. A recording of this presentation will be available at a later date.
Hello, and thank you so much for listening. Again, we do have a Q&A coming up, so stay tuned here. If you do have questions, you can drop those in the Q&A pod at the bottom. Those questions will be answered anonymously. No names will be attached to those. And at the end of this recording, or at the end of the Q&A portion of this presentation, we will stop the recording. So both the recording of the webinar and the Q&A portion will be included in the recording that will be available at a later date. I did see a question that came up earlier that asked if these slides will be made available. We will not be sending these slides out directly to you, but you will be able to take a look at the recording later. So let's jump into it, and I'm going to pull up our questions here and we can get started. Alrighty, so first question, looks like this will be a Brandon question. What if the land owned in a different town? What if the land is owned in a different town? Do we need the hazard mitigation plan to be on that town's plan? Brandon?
Hello, can you hear me, Carly?
There we go. Yes.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah,
Hello.
this is Brandon Suiza, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Section Chief. Thank you so much for coming to today's webinar. So for the first question, sorry, I had a little bit of a communication break, but just again, it's what if the land owned in a different town, or what if the land is owned in a different town? Do we need a hazard mitigation plan to be on that town's plan as well? So if you have a project that spans multiple jurisdictions, and the work would be being done on, that would spread into that other jurisdiction, you would have to have, both jurisdictions would have to have approved hazard mitigation plans in effect.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brandon. Really appreciate it. Our next question looks like it's going to go to Morgan. So Morgan, can deployable perimeter barriers be part of a funded mitigation solution to reduce risk?
So that's a very good question. It's come up in the past. Because every mitigation project is very different, they often have unique elements to them that in one situation could be considered eligible and others not. So oftentimes the typical description of a deployable perimeter barrier would be something that is not a permanent solution. So because it is not a permanent mitigation solution, it would not be eligible. But there are other types of automatic barriers that may be considered depending on the project's design.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that detail, Morgan. Really appreciate it. Let's see here. And you can continue to ask questions as we're going through the questions that have already been dropped in that Q&A pod, so feel free to continue to add those there. Looks like our next question is for Nora. So Nora, can a sub-applicant seek FMA funds to conduct hydrologic studies and alternatives analysis?
Hello, the answer is yes. And this can be funded through project scoping.
We'd love to hear it. Awesome. Thank you. Really appreciate it, Nora. Alrighty. We're seeing some more questions get dropped in here. This is awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Let's see. All right, next question we've got on here. How do you know if your community has a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan? And I'm going to throw that one to Brandon.
Great, thanks. And so there's a couple of different sources on FEMA.gov. There is a web page dedicated to the hazard mitigation plan status. There is a map that indicates whether the status for the plans that is updated. Another source is to contact your local emergency management office. You can either contact them directly and also have questions in terms of eligibility of projects and availability of funding. So they're also a great source. And you can also use Google and Google search your community's hazard mitigation plan. A lot of communities do post and publish that hazard mitigation plan online, so you can see not only if that plan is in effect, but also what the details of that plan are. For example, looking at the plan and seeing if the area that you're considering a mitigation project or have questions about is included in the plan, what sort of hazards is flooding a big risk in that area as identified the plan, and other really important information that definitely can help inform the project development phase of your application.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brandon. Really appreciate it. Our next question is for Morgan. Morgan, we're going to bring you back. Has the FMA program adopted alternative cost effectiveness methodology in place of benefit cost analysis? I believe the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant program, adopted alternative methodology to further Justice 40 goals.
Yes, thank you for that question. The alternative cost-effective methodology for fiscal year 22 that was for BRIC program, it was also used for the FMA program and will continue to be used in fiscal year 23.
Excellent. Thanks, Morgan. So speaking of fiscal year 23, Brandon, we've got a question for you. Folks are really excited about the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. They want to know, has the FMA 2023 NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, been released? If so, where can I find it? If not, when could I expect to see it?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for this question. And we are extremely excited that everyone is so excited to hear about this funding opportunity. As you all know, FMA has had a significant bump up in funding due to the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're really excited to get the opportunity out, but it has not been cleared all of the clearance process. We are estimating it to come out soon, but do not have an exact timeline. We are taking into consideration that, you know, what the shutter this provides for local communities, states, our tribal governments and territories, and the District of Columbia, you know, how this impacts application timeframes that you have. So we will be looking into that and taking that into consideration in terms of how our release and, you know, how we're building out the schedule. But I don't have anything to share as of today on the deadline, other than that to stay tuned. Definitely register for updates from the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. Stay tuned for the newsletters and other information that comes out. And hopefully you should be getting some good news soon about the program.
Absolutely. We love to hear it. We love to hear it. And we thank you all for your patience. All righty, let's see, what other questions do we have coming in? Feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat as they come to mind. Let's see. Thank you all. I'm just reviewing through some questions here to see what's next. Again, you can continue to drop those in our Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. Looks like we might have had a question earlier about the FEMA web link for hazard mitigation plans. So I am getting that link for you right now. Working on that one. And we can try to drop that one in the chat for you to make that a little bit easier. Looks like the page is called the Hazard Mitigation Plan Status, and the URL is FEMA.gov/emergency-management/risk-management/planning/status. That is a mouthful right there. So we will drop that one in the chat for you. Thanks so much for that question. Alrighty, looks like we have a question here for Brandon. Brandon, can you please give an idea of review timelines for flood buyouts for homes under the FMA and HMGP programs? We are a sub-applicant, a city, and field a lot of questions on how long is this all going to take from our residents whose houses are being bought out?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. We get it commonly. I would say, you know, the best source of the information on timelines would be from the state hazard mitigation officer from the state that is administering the program. They generally have a good idea, a good handle of how long it takes. FMA is an annual competitive program. It has an application period that opens and closes. And from that closing date, we go into a full national review of applications and then announce selections. Once selections are announced, those projects will go into a pre-award phase, which will finish up all of the remaining eligibility requirements. Depending on things like the feasibility of the project, if the engineering drawings are sufficient, also environmental historic preservation requirements, is a historic home, are there sensitive areas? Those can all attribute to longer review periods for these types of projects. Once those projects are reviewed and go through that pre-award stage, then they're awarded. The state and the local community still has a lot of work from that point, though, to do contracting, additional logistics, planning, and ensuring that they have all the funding prepared and pieces together to implement the project. So when it comes to these projects, it's not only the FEMA reviews, but also the implementation by the state and local community to get these projects completed. So the review times definitely do vary.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon. Really appreciate that. All right, taking a look at any more questions, continue to drop those in the pod, the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to those. Oh, it looks like we got that link in there to the hazard mitigation status page. Thank you so much. Take a look at that page for your statuses. We'll give Q&A just a few more minutes to continue to drop those questions there for us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Awesome. All right, get more questions in here. Thank you for your patience. All righty, it looks like we've got one for Morgan here. So Morgan, we're going to put you on the spot. If my $1 million application from last year was selected for further review but has not been awarded, can I apply for the $50,000 technical assistance, not knowing if my application will be approved or awarded this year?
And I'm assuming that me in this case is an applicant, a state or tribe. If that is the case, the $1 million project was selected the previous year, then you are eligible for that $50,000 in technical assistance the following year.
Excellent, good to hear. Thank you, Morgan. So, just reviewing a few more questions here, making sure we're going to get to everything we can. Questions. Thank you all for bearing with me. Lots of good stuff to read. Okay, all right. I think we've got another one for Mr. Brandon. So Brandon, we're going to put you on the spot. Is there any mechanism within FMA or other mitigation programs that would allow a community to purchase flood damaged properties and get reimbursed after the fact? We have found that the process takes so long that people don't want to or can't wait for FEMA mitigation dollars to get allocated. When someone doesn't have a home, waiting a year or more for buyouts is not a tenable situation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this question. This is something that we've really been struggling with here and trying to figure out a better solution. So just a little background with the annual program. Again, as I mentioned, the cycle that it takes, it's a competitive program with an open period for applications, a close, a review. And that process, as we've seen over, the last over 10 iterations I've seen of the Flood Mitigation Assistance program since about 2016. Under that, it's a very long process. And for someone who has been flooded repetitively or, in a way that their home is substantially damaged, and want to get out of their home, they're looking for a quicker solution. And so this is a very forward-thinking way of doing it. However, they wouldn't be eligible for a program because they still need to get approval prior to that. So that's under the annual program. However, we do have an initiative that just recently is wrapping up in terms of the availability of the funding. And we are learning more about how the dynamics of that works. And it was called the FY22 Swift Current Initiative. And how that program was built was that we were looking to get funding made available around a presidentially declared disaster, which was Hurricane Ida in this case. And by making that funding available in line with that disaster scenario, we were hoping to speed up award and development of these projects quickly that is more aligned to the disaster survivor experience and less about, this annual competitive nature. We were really looking at this initiative for future build out and think that this will provide an awesome solution for more timely mitigation in line with the disaster survivor experience. So would definitely stay tuned for more opportunities in the future as we look to see the successes of this initiative. But currently, yes, this type of activity, we're not able to permit funding for work that has already begun.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate that detail. I see a question about signing up for FEMA communication notification. So we will make sure you get a link in the chat. I'm not going to try to read out the URL. We'll make sure that is dropped in the chat for you to get FEMA notifications or FEMA communications. It looks like we have another question here. I'm going to point to Nora. Nora, is it possible for a city to be selected for more than one application in a year?
Hello, yes, the answer is yes. Yeah, it is possible for a city to be selected for more than one application in a year.
There we go, good stuff. So I guess send them in. Thanks, Nora. All right, we're going to give it a few more minutes and then we will wrap up the Q&A portion here shortly. So if you've got any last minute questions, please throw those into the Q&A portion or the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to some of those. Alrighty, I see one more question here. I'm going to point this one to Brandon. Brandon, can a sub-applicant be added to a mitigation plan if their property is within the jurisdiction? We are a school district and our schools fall within several areas in our county.
Yeah, this is a great question. So school districts should participate in the hazard mitigation plan as they work to develop it. Absolutely. This really will help the school district do things like a risk assessment, understanding what their risk is and potential solutions that include mitigation in order to assess, things like flooding, fire, earthquake, all of those things for the school district to help best manage, natural disaster risk. So absolutely, I would, if I was a school district, I would want to get in touch with that local jurisdiction's office that's going to be heading that hazard mitigation plan. Typically, it's like an emergency management section of that jurisdiction and be included in the hazard mitigation planning effort. It's really going to set you up for not only understanding your risk and being able to work on solutions that you'll be able to mitigate that risk, but also to take advantage of funding and be competitive both from the state's priorities as well as FEMA's.
Love it. Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon. I think maybe we're going to call it there with our Q&A portion of our webinar. So with that, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us with the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program's Localized Flood Risk Reduction webinar. In just a moment, you're going to see a set of polls come up on your screen. So please take some time to give us your feedback. Those should be popping up here shortly. Please give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate any feedback that you have for us. Again, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Again, today's session will be recorded and available at a later date with both that pre-recording as well as this Q&A portion. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your time today.